Sometimes I read a Bible passage and I stop and think, how is that possible? I mean, don't get me wrong, there's sometimes I look in the mirror and I think of the actions that I commit in my own life and I think, how is that possible? But when I look at a text from the inspired Word of God, there are certain times it startles me and I can't help but just think, how is that even possible? John chapter 1, verses 9 through 11 is one of those verses. It says this: the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. This is Jesus. This is Jesus, the light of the world, coming into the world. And it says, He was in the world, and though the world was made through Him, the world did not recognize Him. He came to that which was His own, but His own did not receive Him. How is that possible? How is it possible that the Creator of the universe comes to His creation, and the creation not only doesn't recognize Him, it doesn't receive Him? I mean, my goodness, the creation not only doesn't receive Him, creation kills Him. How is this possible? Or let me ask it a little bit of a different way. When love became flesh, why did we kill it? And what does that say about us? In Matthew chapter 21, Jesus is speaking to a group of religious leaders, and He begins telling them a parable of a wicked tenant that's tending to a vineyard that's not even his own. He's tending to a vineyard owned by a distant landowner. And what's interesting is as the parable progresses, the landowner would send servant after servant to his vineyard. And whenever he would get there, the tenants would beat and berate each servant. Finally, the owner of the vineyard says, I'll send my son. I mean, they'll respect my son. And instead, what do? Well, in the parable, the wicked tenants take the son and they kill him, thinking that they will be able to claim his inheritance. So, Jesus then looks at the religious leaders and He asks this simple but striking question. He says, when the master of the vineyard comes to his vineyard, to what he owns, what will he do with those wicked tenants? Well, the Jewish leaders all excited because they know the answer. Chapter 21, verse 41 of Matthew, they raise their hands and they cry out and they say, He will bring those wretches to a wretched end. And He will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give Him His share of the crop at harvest time. Verse 43, Jesus replied, You're right. Indeed, the kingdom of heaven will be taken from those who refuse to produce its fruit and given to a people who will. Now here's the part that just boggles my mind. Verses 45 through 46 of Matthew 21, the religious leaders respond to Jesus' parable with this. It says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew He was talking about them. They knew He was talking about them and suggesting that they were the wicked tenants. So what did they do? Well, they began seeking for a way to arrest Him so they could kill Him. How is that possible? I mean, did they not see? They were the ones that even pronounced judgment on the wicked tenant. But then they do the very same thing that the tenant did that they know is evil? You know, I find that we do quite similar things in this world today, where we choose what we know is evil over what we know is good. And we do it almost with a smile. Why is that? Why is it that choosing evil seems more fun than choosing good? Why is it that whenever we read about holiness in the Bible, it seems more foreign to us, but when we read about the sins, it seems a lot more familiar? I mean, why is it that we run towards death and darkness to solve our problems? Why is it that we run towards evil instead of towards the light? Or to put it another way, when love became flesh, why did we kill it? Well, here's the answer. The answer is, in Eden, God, as we talked about in our last session, God created us with the ability for union. He created us with the opportunity to unite. But remember, we used our union to unite with death. We became one flesh with death, so that what death thinks, how death acts, how death moves, so do we. That actually what it happens is that we gravitate towards what is most familiar to us. Death. Evil. And so, when love became flesh, we saw it as a threat. We saw it as something to crucify. We saw it as something to destroy. And part of the reason why we don't understand how this is possible is that we don't understand the depths of the problem. We don't understand the depths of union. Union, where two become one flesh. You see, union is not holding hands. Union is more along the lines of this. Where every time we take a drink, or every time we eat a meal, two become one. And when the two become one, they become inseparable. I mean, sure, I could throw up my food from earlier today, but let's be honest. It wouldn't be in the same condition. It sure wouldn't tempt me to eat it again, and I probably wouldn't come out feeling so hot myself. Why? Because whenever union occurs, when two become one, they become inseparable. And to try to separate them is to try to divorce two things that have become one. And when you do, neither one of them will ever be the same again. Which, I mean, the very concept even reminds me of the concept of divorce. You know, it's interesting working with college students because even though these college students will be talking to me about a divorce in their parents that happened 15 years earlier, they will still be sitting on the couch weeping because the wound still seems so fresh. Now hear me clearly. I believe there is grace in divorce. But also hear me clearly. When two become one, tearing them apart affects them and everyone around them. Why? Because union is not just holding hands. Union is the merging of two into one, that to try to separate the one from the other is to try to rip away something that has interwoven in the same way that water has permeated my body, in the same way that food has permeated my body. The problem of sin is way worse than we typically appreciate. The problem of sin is so pervasive because what sin is union with death. When we sin, we continue to choose to become one flesh with death. When we are so consumed by this darkness that if light comes toward us, our natural reaction would be to kill it. Why? Well, because darkness fears the light. That's why. Darkness fears the light. You know, as a child, the opposite was true for me. As a child, I was afraid of the dark, not the light. I mean, as a child, oh my goodness, especially from the basement. Even though I'm the one that turned out the lights, as soon as the lights went off when I was coming up the stairs from my basement, I sprinted as fast as I could. Why? Because I was afraid of the dark. And I remember nights laying in my bed in the same room as my older brother and whispering out his name, wondering if he was still awake. And when I didn't hear a response, I began to become overwhelmed because darkness seemed to be so thick. And yet it was amazing to me that all I had to do was to look across the room at the He-Man nightlight, and all was better. All was well. As if the light was whispering to me, you are not alone. You don't need to be afraid. I'm here with you. And yet somewhere along the way, in my heart, an inversion occurred. Where as an adult, the way that we function today is as if the light is what we are to fear. I mean, why else do we have so many passcodes on our computers or on our internet histories or even on our phones? Why? Because we're afraid of the light. We're afraid of the dark recesses of our heart coming out into the open. I call this wake-up call theology. Have you ever had a wretched soul wake you up by coming in the room and flipping on the lights? You know what I'm talking about? I mean, you've been asleep for 8 hours, but you have to wake up, and so someone comes into your room, and the way they wake you up is just flipping on the light. What do? I mean, if you're like me, it's like this groaning, this like, and I usually try to cower and pull the pillow over my face or the covers up over my eyes. Why? Because the light actually causes me pain. Because after 8 hours of sleeping, I've grown so accustomed to the darkness that whenever the light draws near me, it is a threat to me. It causes me not just discomfort, but actual pain. And all I want to do is extinguish the light. And the same is true with us. The same is true with us that when we become one flesh with death, we become so accustomed to the darkness that if light comes towards us, if light would actually become flesh, the most natural reaction would be for us to kill it, just for a little relief. Why did we kill love when it became flesh? The answer is simple. Because in Eden, we became one flesh with death. And now we speak the grammar of death more fluently than the grammar of life. I mean, this is the whole point in John chapter 8. Where Jesus is speaking to the religious leaders once again, and he keeps saying the words of truth over and over, and they don't understand, and he says, here's the reason why. You take after your father, not Abraham, the devil, who was a liar and a murderer ever since the beginning. And he says, and because I speak truth, you cannot hear me, because you are fluent in your native tongue. Lies. Hear me clearly. I'm not calling us children of Satan. But what I am saying is when we become one flesh with death, don't be surprised if your natural reactions, if your typical thoughts, if the normal ways of you walking, living, moving, and breathing look more like darkness than light. And also don't be surprised if light became flesh, that you and I would be in the crowd chanting, crucify it. Why is this all so important? If we begin to understand how bad the problem actually is, then we will begin to see how beautiful the solution must be.